I'm Stephanie Filardi. Welcome to Mind the Gap, the podcast. I believe many people fall short of living the life of their dreams simply because they get stuck in what I call the gap. The vision behind this podcast is to help you understand how to navigate the gap and in the process, awaken to the life that is waiting for you. It starts now. Let's go. Welcome, friends. Thank you for joining. Let's begin by engaging our breath with those 3 conscious breaths. Inhale. Exhale, let everything go. Inhale, deepening, expanding the lungs. Exhale, release, let go. And one more time, big breath in, filling up, expanding the lungs. Exhale, release, surrender, let it go. And then taking a moment to just doing a scan of the inner body, noticing where there's energy, noticing if there's any contraction anywhere in the body, and see if you can just release a little bit. So if there's tension anywhere or contraction, send your breath there, maybe move a little bit. And really allow yourself the opportunity as you listen to be present and to receive. Today's topic is suffering. Another juicy one right up there with spiritual awakening. So, why am I talking about suffering? I'm speaking about it today because many of us encounter suffering at some time in our life, to some degree. There's suffering that's outside of our control, so things that happen in life that are beyond our control, loss, trauma, devastation. And then there's suffering that is within our control. And it is the suffering that is within our control that I would like to speak about today. As I'm speaking, I'm wondering already if you're getting information, if there's things popping into your consciousness, into your awareness about suffering. Maybe it's your belief on suffering. Maybe there's an area of your life where you feel like you are suffering, right? So suffering can show up in the physical world, right? So our physical body, the stuff that we deal with on the physical plane, could be mental, emotional, financial, spiritual. So today I want to talk specifically about mental and emotional suffering, since then those tend to be 2 of the major ones we experience and impact all the other ones, right? So something the Buddha taught us. The Buddha, contrary to popular belief, did not teach us how to be enlightened. The Buddha taught us how to deal with human suffering. The Buddha taught us how to deal with human suffering, which means that it's inevitable at some point in time. So I will begin by talking about mental suffering. What do I mean by mental suffering? Basically, this comes down to our thoughts, right? Some of us have compulsive, involuntary thoughts. We're addicted to thinking. Our thoughts wake us up at night. They cause worry. They cause turmoil in our body. They distract us. They drain us. So the first area of suffering, mental suffering, most of this we do to ourselves, and we don't even realize it. Now, having said that, I will say that some of us don't yet realize that anything we take in, so a book we read, music we listen to, a TV show or movie we watch, conversations we have with other people, everything that we take in, information, has an impact on our energy body, has an impact on how we feel. So we might not even realize the connection between I turned on the news, or I read the newspaper, or I engaged with this person who typically is negative, and now I feel kind of bad. We might not realize the suffering that we constantly put ourselves through by basic things we do every day. As I've shared in the past, I have made the conscious choice not to watch the news and not to read the newspaper. It does not serve me. And quite frankly, if I did, I would not want to get out of bed because I would be fearful and contracted, thinking we were living in a terrible world. And I don't believe that. I believe we're living in a benevolent world. So, mental suffering. The next is emotional suffering. What do I mean by emotional suffering? So this, I like to say that there's a spectrum here. And on one end of one extreme, we're volatile, we're explosive, we attack, we're angry. On the other end of the spectrum, we're repressed. So we keep it all in, which builds what over time? Resentment. When we repress it, we build resentment. And then we either become depressed or we might go to the other end of the spectrum, which is we might explode and become volatile, right? And oftentimes when we're suffering emotionally and we're repressing and the resentment builds, often the resentment builds toward ourselves. So we may think and feel that we resent the, quote, other person or situation, or in some cases, life itself. But really, on a deeper level, we are resenting ourselves. Why is that? Well, because in some way, we are not honoring a part of ourselves. So something is trying to wake us up. Something is trying to get our attention. And as I've shared in a previous episode, when we wake up in the middle of the night because of our thoughts or because emotionally there's something off, something is trying to get our attention. So there's some suffering that's happening, right? So it's important, as I spoke about in the Spiritually Awakening podcast, to realize and to accept the possibility, minimally, that often we are the cause of our own suffering. So why would we do this, right? Why? You know, some of you might be thinking, absolutely not. That's crazy. Why would I do that? Well, I think a lot of it is unconscious, meaning a lot of us have unconscious beliefs and behaviors that we're not even aware of until somebody, usually someone who we are intimate with or in close relationship with, points it out. Right? That's why I say in all relationships, we have the possibility to heal and to grow and to learn if we see them as such. So I don't believe that most of us are walking around wanting to suffer, wanting to have negative thoughts, or wanting to be emotionally out of balance. I think what ends up happening is that we don't realize that part of being human is dealing with life itself, which brings suffering. So unless we have the tools and the practices and the awareness that it's inevitable, we flounder. We make poor choices. We suffer. We stay in the negative down energy. We leak energy. We lose energy. And then we get into that vicious cycle where we become confused and tired or angry, or we lose motivation. And there's another way. So from a mental perspective, suffering, the larger the gap between where you are now in your life and where you think you ought to be or want to be, the greater the suffering. I will say that again. When it comes to mental suffering, the larger the gap between where you are now in your life and where you think you ought to be or want to be, the greater the suffering. So the greater the gap, the greater the suffering. And that's what I talk about in this podcast, Mind the Gap. It's how do we deal with those transitions? I spoke about it in the Spiritual Awakening episode, where I said you might be at a point in your life where something needs to shift on the outside, but you're still having to deal with it. You cannot, for whatever reason, change your situation or leave your situation right now. So there has to be this place of patience and compassion and understanding. How are you able to navigate the gap of where you are and where you want to go by not adding more suffering? And in my experiences, the practices that help with this are the practices that teach me how to be present, how to enjoy the present moment, right? So I'm not only talking about being dedicated to a practice of writing and meditating. I'm also talking about choosing to enjoy what is in front of me. And a lot of times what ends up happening is when you start to shift your mindset and say, okay, this is where I am. I'm going to make the best of it, right? So I'm going to give an example. You plan this amazing vacation and you've taken the time off, you've saved the money, everyone's schedule aligns, you go away and it rains the whole time and all you wanted was the sun. So you have two ways to spend that time. You can be miserable and complain that it's raining, or you can open yourself up to maybe other activities, other things to do, other ways of being. So it's often in those challenging times and those times that feel like initially they're suffering that we learn and that we grow and we develop. We develop the ability to see things differently, which gives us the opportunity to be differently in the world, right? To be differently in the world. And then we take that lesson, because it's always a lesson, and then we apply it to other things and other areas in our life. So this mental suffering, noticing in your own life, are there places where there's this big gap, saying that we want to be over there, right? There's that human tendency to say, it's better over there, or I'll be happy when. And what I have found is that the happiness is a choice now. Happiness is a choice now. So find the practices that support your mental well-being. On an emotional level, emotional suffering, it's the resistance. It's the resistance to the emotion. And as I spoke of before, sometimes the resistance looks like simply not allowing ourselves to fully feel something. Some of us will not get angry. We don't want to get angry, right? So there's this repression sometimes that happens. So when we're afraid, when we resist what's coming up, that's a form of emotional suffering, because the spirit, the body, the soul knows. And if we don't acknowledge it and give it space and try to understand it, we will continue to suffer and we will be out of balance. And as I said before, we might repress it and then get depressed, build resentment, or we might be explosive. So we might actually do more damage, not only to ourself and the relationship we have with ourself, which is the most important relationship, but we might even do damage to other relationships. And ultimately, if we are not living true to who we are and honoring that we have the ability to feel the full range of human emotion, we're shortchanging ourselves and we're kidding ourselves. And quite frankly, it's an illusion. Because the only way that you can really fully experience joy is if you've ever known deep sadness, right? So, and that's what is the experience of life. I think sometimes there's this tendency to want to always feel pleasure and always be happy. And there's this idea that there's something wrong with us if we wake up in a bad mood when it seems like we have everything. And what I'll say to that is, when we're in bed at night, we're sleeping, ideally, right? So our body is at rest and all the energy is stagnant. So unless you get up out of bed and you're bouncing off the walls happy, which I don't know too many people, a lot of us have to physically move our body to move some of that stagnant energy. And we have to do certain practices, right? So that's not a bad thing or a wrong thing. It's simply knowing ourselves and knowing who we are. So from an emotional standpoint, just noticing what's your tendency. What's your tendency? Are you resistant to emotions? Do you judge yourself? Are you afraid? That's the other thing. Some of us are afraid to fully feel. I went through that, and I still go through it at times. It's a feeling maybe of losing control, or maybe beating ourselves up that we shouldn't feel that way. It's not necessarily modeled really well, managing emotions, I think, for many of us. So maybe growing up, we saw them either repressed or acted out in a way that was not productive or constructive. So the ability to emotionally regulate ourselves and honor how we feel and get the emotions out in a healthy way is important for our own well-being and also for healthy relationships in our life. And so those two areas, the mental and the emotional, those two areas in life create a lot of suffering for people. So what do you do with the emotional? Same thing. You find the tools and the practices to support you. So when I'm going through a time in my life where I feel more emotionally vulnerable or out of balance, or I'm having a hard time reining in the emotions, then I look at the practices in my life and I say, well, maybe there's something different I need to do. Maybe I need to add something or change something. So maybe I need to, in addition to my practices of writing and meditation, maybe I need to be more vigorous with my physical activity, right? That's been known. Moderate to vigorous physical activity most days of the week serve us well because it moves the energy. So without always having to psychoanalyze it and understand why is this here, sometimes it's a matter of putting on the music and dancing. And I have playlists. I have a playlist called You Are So Hot. And it's wonderful. It's all upbeat music, great dance music that I love, that makes me feel good, that I can listen to at any point in time. I can listen and I can dance, and it moves the energy. So finding what works for you and think about also people in your life, right? I think sometimes there's a tendency to want to reach out to certain people when we feel emotionally vulnerable or we're having an experience. And it could be with our intimate partner or it could be with a family member. And sometimes they're not the right people to reach out to if we're in that reactive space because they're involved and they're going to have their own experience and they might react. So this is when it's helpful to have either a coach or a mentor or a trusted friend. So someone that you can talk to, that can be a mirror, that can hold space for you. So in times that are more challenging, those are the times when we need more support, right? Listen to a podcast, watch a video. So do the things that uplift you. Surround yourself with positive people who are present, who are prospering. Right? Surround yourself with people like that. So that's in your choice. That's in your ability to choose. I want to have a different outcome. If you want a different outcome, then you have to make a different choice. So giving yourself permission to do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Because life is short and we all deserve to live well, to feel good, to receive the blessings and the prosperity that this universe offers to each and every one of us. There is more than enough to go around. And part of these podcasts are designed to help you retrain your brain so that you can become masters of your mind, so that you can shift when you notice yourself going to that negative place or you notice yourself wallowing in the suffering without beating yourself up or judging yourself, simply making another choice. To stand in the light, to stand in the positive, to stand in the prosperity, and to receive it, because it's possible. Remembering that nothing is wasted, and any suffering that you have endured up until this point in time, and that you will endure, is never wasted because there's always a lesson, there's always growth, if you choose to see it as such. So perhaps over the next few days, reflect on your life, and notice if there's an area where you are suffering needlessly. Notice and then decide what you want to do about it. Maybe it's building a healthier relationship with your thoughts. Maybe it's getting support around how to process some heavy emotions. I can go on and on. For each of us, it's different. What I will say, it's about honoring yourself and remembering that the highest form of spiritual practice is non-judgmental, compassionate self-awareness. The highest form of spiritual practice is non-judgmental, compassionate self-awareness. I support you. I'm with you. If you like what you hear, please give us a positive review. Please share it with your friends. Help someone who is needlessly suffering by inviting them to listen to this and maybe even have a conversation about it. Thank you for listening. Let's go. You are so hot.